what's the difference between book smarts and street smarts? Well, let me answer this in terms of my disciplines, which is moral and political philosophy. I mean, there are some smarts that are book smarts that don't really get compromised if they aren't accompanied by street smarts. And even some areas of philosophy are like that. Some of the more technical areas of philosophy that are less to do with the social world, you could make that case there. In other words, you could have a professor of logic who really, really, struggles to understand the emotions their child feels, That's harder to imagine with a good moral philosopher. So let's put a couple, because this could be an eternal conversation, let's put a couple of things on the table. At the very pinnacle of work in moral and political philosophy, there is no such thing as book smarts without street smarts. Because you can't do great moral philosophy unless it has depth, and the depth it's going to have is that it permeates the texture of everyday practical human life. So it's not that you get to street smarts through book smarts, not at all. It's rather that the stuff you put into your book, you put in as somebody who has extraordinary street smarts. And if you don't do that, you're not going to be a great moral political philosopher. You're not going to be, Nietzsche or Plato. Now, what about if we go lower down in the professions? If we talk about professional academics, or if we talk about people who have highly esteemed positions beyond just an ordinary academic position, somebody who has an esteemed chair in moral or political philosophy at one of the world's greatest universities, do they need to have street smarts to get to that position? This is almost an institutional question. No. I do think street smarts could help, right? And street smarts, I don't mean how to get a good deal on something at the market. I mean street smarts as in you've got to be good at living your life. And you've got to be good at living your life by understanding it well. Because, of course, as one of my great heroes, Richard Wolheim, liked to say, living a life well mostly just is understanding it. I do think it's possible to get to an esteemed chair in moral political philosophy and have worse moral judgment and worse political judgment than the bus driver, a random bus driver. It's possible. I think you're likely to have slightly better political judgment, certainly, than the average bus driver, but there's no guarantee of that at all. The possibility is more than 10% that the bus driver will have better political judgment than the professor of moral philosophy. But of course, there's going to be this huge advantage that the professor has, and that is the professor will know everything that's ever been said about a certain issue. So if you ask a bus driver, mate, what do you reckon freedom is? Like, what's that? What's it all about? What is freedom? A bus driver will be inventing, to a good extent, an answer in ignorance of things that have been said about this historically. Whereas even a kind of quaint or naive moral or political philosopher will be able to say, well, 73 things have been said about this in the last 2,000 years, and this is what I think is the best thing to say about it. Now, that doesn't mean that they're going to be right, but it means that they're going to be making a professional error, by which I mean that they're going to be making an error while still having most of the options on the table before them, whereas without that professional training, you just can't have these options. So I danced around, but we've touched on it enough, I think, to say that that's an appetizer of an answer. Can you elaborate on your tweet? And the tweet was, in our culture, independent thinker and independent researcher often mean a person with a predictable combo of logically disconnected counter-establishment views who watches a predictable combination of YouTube channels. Yes, of course there is the person who watches Jordan, who watches Brett and Heather, and 2 or 3 other podcasts, and it's entirely predictable what they're going to say about every issue. These categories, independent thinker, independent researcher, are normatively impeccable, and there are some marvelous people who would call themselves independent researcher. But when you have that appear in Twitter bios, there's some reason to be preemptively suspicious. Because what we've got in our culture is a trend where people call themselves an independent thinker who adopt a predictable constellation of views that sort of nail them to the board in a completely embarrassing way, not because they're right or wrong about any one of these views, but because the idea that large groups of people should have that very same combination of views is so comically implausible and unreal, and it's a product of whatever it is a product of, it's the very opposite of thinking for yourself and thinking freely. So the idea that you think for yourself is a very beautiful and very important idea. It's very different to the idea of being an original thinker. I do believe everybody can think for themselves, actually, whereas almost nobody can be an original thinker. It's very fascinating how when you look at somebody's 3 positions on something, you can read off their 4th and the 5th even without asking them about it. There's a real phenomena of that, and that's unhealthy. It's politically unhealthy, it's culturally unhealthy, and it's partly produced by algorithms and audience capture. What you often see is this happening to creators. So a creator let's make this completely uncontroversial and take this out of politics, public health, management, and so on. I start a YouTube podcast where my key interests are how amazing sourdough bread is and how incredible freshly squeezed celery juice is. But every month, because of the way I relate to my analytics and respond to them, whether it's about views or retention or minor monetary incentives, I begin to drift to the idea that potatoes are amazing and that panna cottas are terrible. They're just terrible. Panna cottas are the worst desserts in the world. And then what you have is hundreds of thousands of people in these bubbles. Okay, so what do you think about celery juice? Well, I think this. What do you think about potatoes? I think this. Well, okay. You don't have a view about panna cottas. Oh yeah, panna cottas are the worst thing in the world. Yeah, of course. Panna cottas. And immediately when you hear panna cottas, there's a problem. There's a real there's a collective epistemic crisis there. So that's really what I was talking about. Let me sort of connect this a bit to the previous answers, but also pointing something else out that's really important, and that's that even if you're an independent researcher, you're certainly not independent from your discipline. You might be institutionally independent, but you cannot be discipline independent, and that's really important. In other words, me. I mean, I am not attached to university because I'm sick. Although if I were fully well, I'd also bring about a situation where I was not more than just partially attached to university, because that's not how I want to work. But I just don't have the health predicament that it would allow me to work more than 2 or 3 hours a day. But the point is that what I am doing at snail's pace toward my book project, for example, philosophy book project, is not independent in the sense of a discipline. If anything, I often meet academic philosophers and I say, well, hang on, I am more of a philosopher than these people, by which I mean I am in inadequate relation with my belonging to this discipline than they are. And from that, you can't detach yourself. And so the danger here is that you go out and you think for yourself about something detached from the current and historical panorama of expertise on that thing. And as the great public intellectual Clive James used to say, when you think that you can answer every question for yourself without knowing what others who are experts think and have thought, you're not free, you're alone. Next question is a lot, and I think we might only be able to take it in a couple of little bits. It's about how far knowledge is socially constructed, it seems to me. Is it possible for collectives to have knowledge that isn't just an expression of the sum of individually acquired knowledge? Is individual knowledge acquisition an illusion, since we're dependent on others? How do we as societies deal with fundamental antagonisms between different group epistemologies? This is a 3-hour YouTube essay to answer this. Let me have a go by saying a roundabout thing and then a couple of less roundabout things. So let's just, to ground ourselves, say a little bit about collective versus individual explanation. Right. So here you've got to forget about a normative conversation about collective versus individual goods and values. We're not talking about that. We're talking about explanation. How far can we explain why the Second World War started in reference to the actions and intentions and mental states of individuals as opposed to in reference to some other processes? And I think on that, what you want to say is that there is no account of collective explanation that is detached from the idea of individual explanation, and that all practical explanation is in the end going to significantly go through the states and intentions of individual agents. There are a couple of extremes you want to avoid here, obviously. So one extreme says that the states of individual agents just don't matter at all because there are bigger forces at work, maybe power dynamics, institutional dynamics, class dynamics. And that is, as a radical position, of course, completely absurd, because you would have to point out to yourself that if you didn't do something, someone else would have done it. If Schubert hadn't written his piano sonata, somebody else would have written them. Well, that's absurd. Likewise, you don't want to take the comically laughable libertarian views that are often popular on the American internet, which want to put down all explanation to individual states, individual intentions. And that's a very good way to become extraordinarily glib about how politics works. You just cease to understand various kinds of structural and power dynamics. So that's a note on collective versus individual explanatory matters. Let's say something about interpretive resources? Quite certainly. Well, let's take an example. Miranda Fricker wrote a beautiful book called Epistemic Injustice in 2007. And in it, she talks about how women, before certain concepts became available, like harassment, were caught in dynamics of harassment, but couldn't understand what was going on. Because to understand their experience, these women, let's say in 1900, needed to use certain concepts which were not socially available. In other words, the collective hermeneutical resources were unupdated vis-a-vis this deleterious social dynamic that women were in the middle of, and so they couldn't interpret it. Right? So that's absolutely fair. But I mean, this requires an enormously long conversation. Let me just put something else on the table then. I mean, the idea that there are, as you put it, fundamental antagonism between different group epistemologies is an idea that shouldn't be allowed to go too far via a kind of bizarre postmodernism which says that my experience is what I say it is and you can't understand it unless you're me. And there's a lot of that going on in the hyper-identity politics in Western countries. And what you've got to say about it, if you're having and you'd better have a political conversation about it, and we will, but if you're having a non-political conversation, what you've got to say is that there are certain things that don't change depending on what you think about them. So the postmodernist disposition is the kind of thinking it makes it so disposition. So what is really going on here is dependent on what I think is going on here. And that's going to be true in some respects, but it's not going to be true in others. If we talk about how horrific, crypto is all the time, that's going to affect, if we talk about how horrific crypto is in massive numbers, that's going to affect crypto. Or if we talk about how brilliant crypto is in massive numbers, that's going to affect crypto. So what we say about crypto will be partly revealed in what's true about crypto. But whether it's raining here now doesn't depend on what I say about it. And what human psychology is up to a point not really going to depend on what I say about it. It's going to have a certain kind of shape, it's going to have a certain kind of depth to it, and that's going to be that. And so we're going to be back to the issue of interpretation here. Let's say I make the claim that a certain group is systemically disadvantaged. I don't think that a group is systemically disadvantaged because it says so. I think a group is systemically disadvantaged because it is, and often when it says so, it just says so because it is, of course. But I think we can work out whether a group is systemically disadvantaged without simply having to rely on what that group says, although partly us understanding it may be necessarily dependent on us giving that group the space and the voice to show us. But once we're shown what we need to be shown, we can find it intelligible and we can interpret it. So I think that we've got a crisis of bogus relativization of group epistemology is going too far in our politics. Are there any public intellectuals in the US? Serious question, and who are they? I think there are several definitions of public intellectuals, but I think that you want a definition whereby the public intellectual is an intellectual in the first instance, or at least is properly an intellectual, and then is also a public intellectual too. The most serious political public intellectual, even though he may not be so visibly public in North America, is Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher who is in his 90s. In Britain, the leading public intellectual is John Gray. And notice that these are not people who are exactly in the same place on the political spectrum, so we're not going by that, we're going by quality. Is John Gray. John, I would say, is now not an intellectual in a way that's separate from being a public intellectual. John just is a public intellectual, but he was an intellectual before. Chuck Taylor is a serious intellectual and a public intellectual at the same time. When it comes to contemporary culture wars in the United States, a very constructive public intellectual is Mark Liller. But while there are many other public intellectuals in the United States, the number of those who are really good is not going to be enormously high. And you're probably going to find an easier job of discovering amazing science explainers than intellectuals. I mean, a lot of the most because when it comes to making sense of politics, making sense of ethical life, making sense of aesthetic experience, what you basically see as soon as you turn on the light, as it were, is a bunch of people from evolutionary psychology who have very little idea of what they're talking about. What do you mean by legitimate society? I think I misspoke. I meant a legitimate state or legitimate regime. Cartoonishly, the paradigm for legitimacy is not being, in a direct or indirect sense, at war with your people. Once you are at war with enough of your population, directly or indirectly, you cease to be a legitimate political authority. And that's to say that citizens can reject not just the consequences, the decisions, the policies that you've come up with, but they can now reject the process that's generated them. And once they reject, normatively reject the process that's generated them, then they can say, well, I'm in the power of this regime, I'm in the power of Mr. Putin, but Mr. Putin is no more president of Russia than Ivan next door is. It's just that Mr. Putin is an Ivan with the power to say that he's president of Russia and get away with it. So the key distinction here that cartoonishly might be helpful to start with is the distinction between the result, accepting the result and rejecting the result, versus rejecting the process that generated the result. So when a transparently legitimate political authority has generated a result that is bad or a result that goes against you, you still accept the process has generated this bad result. This result is bad for you. And if you accept that process generated, you clearly relate to the authority as legitimate. And if you should accept that process has generated the result, then you should. Then you appropriately relate to that authority as legitimate. Well, congratulations if you survive this. Lots of love. Talk soon.